If you wish to, you can turn to the book of 1 Kings, 1 Kings chapter 19 this morning. This will be the beginning of a two-part message that I hope will be helpful. Let me set up the historic background to this text. 3 kings in succession ruled ancient Israel. Saul, Saul's successor David, David's successor, and David's son from Bathsheba, Solomon. So the 3 successive kings were Saul, David, and Solomon. This past month, I mentioned an important date, and that date was 931 BC, more than 9 centuries before Jesus. After Solomon died, and on that date in 931 BC, the ancient nation of Israel that originally consisted of 12 tribes was divided, just as our nation was divided in the 1800s. 10 tribes formed a northern kingdom that continued to be called Israel. The capital of Israel was Samaria. The 2 remaining tribes formed a southern kingdom called Judah, and the capital of Judah was Jerusalem. Throughout the centuries, a succession of 19 different kings ruled over the northern kingdom, and a succession of 19 kings plus 1 queen ruled over the southern kingdom. All 19 kings in the northern kingdom were evil rulers, and in the southern kingdom, 12 kings were evil and 8 kings were good. This narrative we are about to read occurred during the reign of the 7th king who ruled over the northern kingdom called Israel. He was an evil king, and his name was Ahab, and he married a woman named Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel were a diabolical duo that set up altars to the false god Baal and executed God's true prophets. The main character in this section from 1 Kings is the famous prophet Elijah. And Elijah ministered during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. And that turned out to be very problematic, as we're going to see. Let's start reading at 1 Kings 19, beginning at verse 1. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Verse 2, Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. Verse 3, And when he saw that, he arose, this is Elijah, Elijah arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. Verse 4, But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. I read about a funeral home that had a unique advertisement. On the front lawn of this mortuary was a sign that read, Why walk around half dead? We can bury you for less than $5,000. That's creative marketing. According to this passage, Elijah, the famous prophet, was so depressed he had been walking around half dead. Elijah suffered from manic depression to the point that he actually wanted God to cancel his subscription to life. He made this statement in verse 4, It is enough, meaning I have had enough. I can't take any more of this. Elijah actually told God he wanted to die. If depression is left unchecked, it is literally life-threatening. In fact, almost all suicides and suicide attempts are the direct result of sudden and/or prolonged episodes of severe depression. The symptoms of depression are obvious and detectable. Listen to these: loss of appetite, loss of sleep, and then sometimes the opposite extreme, that being too much sleep, overindulgence in food, or beverages, and that would be me. Disinterest in life in general. There's this attitude that nothing seems to matter. Hypochondria. This person always complains about some imagined physical problem. Unkept appearance, meaning he looks like something the cat drugged in. Occasional loss of sex drive. Loss of any ambition to achieve. There's this attitude, nothing is going to get any better, so why bother? Unexplained crying spells. Probably more women do this than men. Feelings of heaviness and oppression, an extremely negative self-image. People constantly down on themselves are probably depressed. Antisocial behavior, a sense of isolationism, which includes withdrawing from people. We call that cocooning. Hypersensitivity. Basically, we have to walk on eggshells around these people because it seems that just the most benign and minute thing sets them off. Incredible mood swings. Some depressed people resemble Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Good mood, bad mood, good mood, bad mood, and these people can flip on a dime. Question, if these are some of the symptoms, then what are some of the causes? What causes these symptoms? What are some of the things that cause depression and cause these symptoms we just mentioned? And after carefully reading through this passage, the next question is, how can someone who has the elite and unique status of an Old Testament prophet like Elijah be so down, so depressed, that he's actually suicidal? How is that possible? What creates that sort of severe depression? Just how does someone become depressed? Are there contributing factors to depression? I believe that there are. So using Elijah as an example, let me describe 4 factors that can substantially contribute to someone's depression. Now understand, these 4 factors do not cure depression, but these factors cause depression. These 4 factors are the sources of depression and not the solution per se, although sometimes the solution to a problem is found to be inherent in the source of that problem. I believe we can better defend ourselves against depression if we just know when to anticipate depression. So this message is designed to act as sort of preventive medicine. As Benjamin Franklin once said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, meaning that it is better to prevent something from going wrong than it is to repair or replace that something once it has gone wrong. This is going to be a 2-part message. This morning we're going to address the causes for depression, and next Sunday we're going to address the cures for depression, so that means you have to come back. One of the reasons we're doing this is because this particular subject affects me on a personal basis. I have been taking a minimal dosage of a prescribed depression medication from long before we moved here, because depression is an epidemic problem in the pastorate. A former megachurch pastor who himself has suffered much from depression made this statement: depression medication sales have increased more than 400% in North America during the past 2 decades, but churches aren't talking about it. He said he had never heard a sermon on the subject of depression because, quote, it's messy and people don't want to deal with that. I contend it's much messier not to address this subject. So we're going to discuss depression from a biblical perspective. Cause 1 is success. The first cause to depression is success. This might sound strange, but success can actually contribute to someone's depression. Some people believe that extraordinarily successful people are immune to these sorts of emotional problems, but that is absolutely not the case. There are some unusual and successful people that have suffered from severe depression. The famous musician and composer Ludwig van Beethoven died 1827, started losing his hearing at age 28. And around age 44, his hearing loss was complete. most likely caused by a compression of the eighth cranial nerve associated with a disease of the bone called Paget's disease. Beethoven's head became large. He had a prominent forehead, a large jaw, and protruding chin features that are consistent with Paget's disease. Eventually, even his hat and shoes didn't fit him because this disease had caused such bone enlargement. Because of his hearing loss and the subsequent musical difficulties, Beethoven suffered from severe depression. He once said, quote, "As for me, I am in despair so often and would like to end my life." Beethoven didn't commit suicide, but he died from liver disease brought about from his alcoholism. He literally medicated his severe depression through abusing alcohol, and he died as a result of that. Guess who made this statement about himself? "I am the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better." Those sad words came from former President Lincoln. He's probably my favorite president, is Mr. Lincoln. In terms of preaching, no one has been more successful than has Charles Haddon Spurgeon. In modern times, no preacher has been published more and quoted more often than has Spurgeon. And he actually made this statement in a sermon from 1866. He said, "I am the subject of depression of spirit, so fearful that I hope none of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to." No one has had more success in his chosen field than these men had. But all three men suffered from severe and manic depression. The point is, success doesn't mean someone is immune to depression, but instead success might actually mean someone is more susceptible to being depressed, as it did to Elijah. Elijah's depression came almost immediately after some of his most significant achievements as a prophet. Inside just one 24-hour period, God had used him to perform two dramatic miracles. One miracle occurred on top of Mount Carmel as Elijah called down fire from heaven and consumed an animal sacrifice on an altar. And then a second miracle occurred as Elijah came down from Mount Carmel as he actually outran Ahab's horse. We'll comment more on that in a moment. Elijah had just succeeded at performing two significant miracles, and that's something none of us would have been able to duplicate. Calling down fire from heaven? Are you serious? I have trouble lighting the charcoal in the Weber grill. That's not going to happen. Remember this basic principle. Emotional lows come after emotional highs. Emotional lows come after emotional highs. Restated as what goes up must come down. And after every mountain, there is a valley. Think about that statement. What goes up must come down, and after every mountain, there is a valley. If there weren't valleys, there wouldn't be mountains. Do you understand that? If there weren't valleys, there wouldn't be mountains. And the terrain would basically consist of just one big extended plain, as in Kansas and Nebraska, flat as a pancake and boring. Everyone wants the highs, but the highs aren't high unless there are some lows. The highs wouldn't be considered highs if there weren't lows. And so lows and downtimes are a necessary part of the human experience. Elijah's coming off a spiritual and emotional high that is described in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah had just challenged 450 false prophets to a spiritual confrontation on top of Mount Carmel. And the objective behind that contest was to demonstrate in public which of them could call down fire from heaven and consume an animal sacrifice. There were two sides lined up against one another. On one side, there were the false prophets representing the pagan god Baal. And then there was God himself and his prophet Elijah on the opposite side. The confrontation began, and it ended almost as soon as it had started. The final score was God 1, Baal 0. It was a shutout for God. And then because those false prophets were an embarrassment to themselves and a shame to Israel as a nation, Elijah had all of them executed. And I believe that was a justifiable thing to do. The point is, Elijah had been extraordinarily successful. That was Elijah's emotional and spiritual high. But then came the low, because Elijah completely bottomed out in 1 Kings chapter 19. And here's how it happened. We mentioned earlier that the northern kingdom called Israel had a king at that time named Ahab. Ahab was married to Jezebel. Jezebel was the most evil woman in the entire Old Testament. No reasonable mother would dare name her daughter Jezebel. Jezebel brought acute paganism into Israel. She set up Phoenician worship centers. She wanted to eradicate the Jewish religion altogether. So she had God's prophets put to death. And now, since the tables had been turned and Elijah had just executed 450 of her prophets, she was totally bent out of shape, and she wanted serious revenge. She wanted Elijah dead, and she wanted to completely eliminate his influence on Israel. Let's reread verses 1 and 2. And Ahab, being the tattletale that he was, told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. All that Elijah had done on Mount Carmel. Also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Verse 2, Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, meaning as the life of one of the dead prophets, by tomorrow about this time. Paraphrased, Jezebel said, Elijah, if I'm not able to arrange for your funeral in the next 24 hours, then I don't deserve to live, and the gods can kill me. Jezebel issued an actual death threat. She said, Elijah, you're a dead man walking. By this time tomorrow, I guarantee I'm going to make sure that you assume room temperature. Someone said that Elijah was a man that feared God, and he might have been. But at this particular junction, Elijah feared Jezebel more. Elijah was terrified for his life. On Mount Carmel, he had stood face to face against 450 false prophets. And suddenly, not long after that, he was running afraid from just one woman. It was a sense of success that actually contributed to Elijah's depression. Even the secular psychiatric community understands this basic principle. Some time ago, I read an article from People magazine about Dr. Stephen Berglas, a clinical psychologist at the Harvard Medical School. He runs the Executive Stress Clinic. Get that? Executive Stress Clinic in Boston, which is advertised as a treatment center for people who hit bottom after they reach the top. He said that a typical case might sound like this. The subject is 33 years old and vice president of a manufacturing corporation. He has a $250,000 annual salary, 2 Mercedeses, and an expensive home in the suburbs. He also uses cocaine, cheats on his wife, and sometimes misses business meetings that he calls himself. Dr. Berglas insists that this man is essentially a victim of his own success. So just when can we anticipate possible depression? The answer is right after some success, right after a profitable counseling session and putting a fragmented marriage back together, right after a building project. It is an incredible percentage of pastors that resign churches in the first 6 months after finishing a successful building program. We can anticipate depression right after a Dave Ramsey financial seminar. We've taught that often in previous pastorates, and I hope to teach it here. Right after an exciting summer vacation, right after a short-term missions trip, right after a spiritual retreat in the mountains, right after a honeymoon, right after an answer to prayer, right after getting a better job, right after a promotion and raise. The fact is, we go up, and at some point we have to come down. Consider the stock market. It never just goes up and up and up and up and up. No. The stock market goes up and then down some more, and then goes up slightly and then down some more. And sometimes the market can crash. And so does the rest of our life. But we should be careful in coming down. Coming down is inevitable. We should be careful, though, that in coming down we don't fall into a state of depression. So sometimes success is succeeded by periods of depression, and we need to be aware of that. Now, that doesn't mean we should be paranoid that something's going to happen, but just be aware that it's entirely possible. There is, though, a second reason Elijah was depressed, and that is fatigue. Cause 2 is fatigue. Elijah was totally fatigued. There are cases where depression is the direct result of physiological reasons that are unrelated to spiritual problems. Some people think depression is always the result of spiritual inadequacy, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes chronic depression is the result of legitimate medical conditions. For instance, consider the case of a chemical imbalance. Our brain relies on substances called neurotransmitters to maintain a healthy, stable mood. But an imbalance of those neurotransmitters can create drastic mood swings and cause serious depression. One example is that medical researchers have noticed that the part of the brain called the hippocampus is vital to the storage of memories. Scientists have noticed the hippocampus is smaller in chronically depressed people than in those that don't often suffer from depression. We don't know exactly why, but that's an important difference because a smaller hippocampus has fewer serotonin receptors. Serotonin is basically a brain calming neurotransmitter that facilitates communication between the brain and the body. And according to the latest scientific research, the brains of depressed people have less serotonin. There are other physiological problems that can cause or contribute to depression: hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, hypothyroidism, endocrine hormone imbalances in blood levels of estrogen or adrenaline, viral infections such as the flu or mononucleosis or COVID, vitamin shortages, exposure to industrial poisons, beta blockers found in certain medications such as high blood pressure medications, generational genetic propensity toward depression, meaning someone receives a certain susceptibility to depression from his parents. And then there's the most frightening condition known to mankind, PMS. PMS can contribute to severe depression. That was supposed to be a joke, but are we awake? I hope so. Sometimes someone's spiritual condition, no matter how robust it might be, is not enough to compensate for physiological factors that should be diagnosed and then treated by medical professionals. I believe Elijah had a legitimate physiological problem. He was absolutely exhausted. And so it's not a surprise he was depressed. Let me put this situation into its historical perspective. Listen carefully. 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 45 illustrates how fatigue affected Elijah's emotional behavior. Verse 45, this comes right after Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel. He's still there on the mountain. Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. Notice, so Ahab, remember Ahab, the king, rode away and went to Jezreel. Verse 46, then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. King Ahab had also been on Mount Carmel at the site of this confrontation. He wanted to witness it. There was a tremendous storm coming, so Ahab was anxious to get down the mountain to Jezreel so that he could tell Jezebel just what had happened. Notice that Elijah girded up his loins and ran. An ancient girdle was a belt-like apparatus. It might have been made from linen or leather. It wrapped around someone's waist like a belt. Remember, people then wore long robes. So someone would wrap this girdle around his waist, just as we would tighten a belt around our waist. For Elijah to gird up his loins meant he pulled his girdle in tight around his abdomen area, which wrapped his robe in close around him so he wouldn't get tangled up in his robe as he ran. In fact, it was common for someone, if he needed to reach down and pick up the bottom of his robe and tuck the bottom of his robe into the inside of his girdle, which created sort of a mini skirt effect, which probably wasn't exactly a fashion statement, but it was effective as this gave him freedom to run without fear of tripping because of his robe. So the statement is made that Elijah girded up his loins, and from some point on Mount Carmel, he started running down the mountainside to Jezreel. To be intellectually honest, we don't know the exact location where Elijah started on Mount Carmel, but contingent on where he was when he started to run, estimates are the distance from Mount Carmel to Jezreel was from 16 to 21 miles. 16 to 21 miles. Please notice that Elijah didn't walk. Elijah didn't jog. Elijah ran. Elijah was a prophet, probably middle-aged or older. Elijah hadn't been training for a marathon. Notice Elijah was running downhill. And long-distance runners understand that running downhill is extremely difficult. It's like putting one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake at the same time. This running downhill at full speed puts tremendous stress on the legs. And to make it more difficult, Elijah's not running on some sort of smooth pavement or rubberized track. Elijah's running on rocky, mountainous terrain, which made the footing unstable and unsafe. Notice that verse 45 said, Ahab rode down the mountain to Jezreel. And then verse 46 reads that Elijah ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance to Jezreel. So Ahab was seated on his horse, riding down the mountainside, and then there was this crazy prophet Elijah that actually ran ahead of him. God so energized Elijah that he outran Ahab's horse down a mountainside, as much as 21 miles to Jezreel, and that was miraculous because it was almost a marathon. Going downhill in the rough terrain of a mountainside and through a rainstorm. But Elijah had a big problem once he got to Jezreel, verse 3. And when he saw that, meaning when he had heard this threat on his life from Jezebel, he arose and went for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So Elijah got to Jezreel, and we don't know exactly how long he was there, probably just long enough to catch his breath, because once Ahab told Jezebel what had happened, she was so upset she wanted him dead. So she threatened Elijah. Elijah heard about that threat, and he was afraid for his life, so he got up and he journeyed to Beersheba. Again, we aren't sure, but estimates are that from Jezreel to Beersheba was from 95 to 116 miles. That is an extremely long journey. And the question is, just how did Elijah get there? It is theoretically possible that he rode, but he probably couldn't afford to own a beast of burden himself, such as a camel or donkey or horse. So unless he borrowed one, it is more probable that he walked and or ran. That means Elijah walked and or ran from Jezreel to Beersheba, a total of from 95 to 116 miles. Can someone spell totally wiped out? But he wasn't finished. Verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down. About time he sat down, don't you think? He sat down under a broom tree. The broom tree was a flowering desert shrub that sometimes reached a height of 8 feet. So he sat down under this broom tree for shade to recover. Now please notice that after Elijah got to Beersheba, he didn't stop there, but he continued to go on and hide from Jezebel. He went another day's journey into a desolate wilderness area so that he couldn't be found. Biblical authorities interpret a day's journey to be a distance from 20 to 30 miles. Okay, so let's put this all together. Elijah started on Mount Carmel. He ran down the mountainside ahead of a horse as much as 21 miles from Mount Carmel to Jezreel, and he did that in a rainstorm. He then received a death threat from Jezebel. He got up and walked or ran as much as another 116 miles from Jezreel to Beersheba. And then because he was still afraid, he walked a day's journey equivalent to 20 to 30 miles into a remote wilderness area. And then he sat down. Elijah was tired times 1,000. Every muscle in his entire body ached. He sat there and said, "Pass me the Bengay." He was fatigued to the point of utter exhaustion. So there was a legitimate reason for his depression. Who wouldn't have been? God created the normal human to function inside certain physiological boundaries. Depression happens when we extend those boundaries to the point of that God has set for our bodies to be on a prolonged basis. God has designed our bodies to function inside certain boundaries. And if we push those boundaries too far and too long, then we break down. As an example, labor and childbirth is one of those instances. In the case of our third son, Hopi had 23 consecutive hours of labor. Much of it back labor. She would have extraordinary pain in her lower back, which meant I stood there and used my fist and put it into her lower back and tried to relieve it somewhat. And I did that hour after hour. It just wore me out. But anyway, 23 hours of labor. That was difficult and depressing enough. But imagine a mother in labor 23 consecutive days, not hours. She wouldn't be depressed. She would be dead. Because the boundaries would have been pushed much too far and much too long, and that would exceed the limits of the human body. Elijah had pushed himself past those normal physiological boundaries. He just didn't have enough human resources to go on. He was completely and utterly exhausted, and as a result of that fatigue, he was severely depressed. We are much more susceptible and vulnerable to depression when we are tired and down in a physiological sense. And that's the reason God encourages us to rest and recharge our bodies. Jesus said to his disciples, Mark 6, verse 31, he said, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." The famous revivalist Vance Havner said, "And if we don't come apart and rest, then we might just come apart." And that happens. Adrian Rogers, I had the opportunity to hear him preach before he passed. He pastored Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis until his death in 2005. He was an amazing preacher. Bellevue has one of this nation's largest church facilities. Imagine a singular worship center and massive lobby, large enough to have more than 14 acres of carpet. And that doesn't count the areas that were tiled. There's also a family life center on their campus that's almost as large. Their changing rooms for their baptistry, because I sneak around, find stuff. Their changing rooms for their baptistry would be almost the size of this room. One morning, Pastor Rogers got a call from one of his 22,000 members. This woman said, "Dr. Rogers, I tried on Monday to reach you, and I couldn't. You weren't in the office." He said, "I'm so sorry, but I was unavailable on Monday. I needed some time off, and so I took Monday off." She said, "You took a day off? I don't understand. Satan doesn't take a day off." He said, "Yes, ma'am, I know that. And if I didn't take a day off like he does, I'd probably act more like him too." Charles Spurgeon said, "Rest time is not waste time. It is economical to gather renewed strength. We can better function, people, if we're not fatigued." Someone has suggested that in order to recharge ourselves, we should do 3 basic things. Notice, divert daily. Create a brief diversion sometime throughout the day. Do something relaxing and fun, even if it's only for 15 minutes. Go for a walk at lunchtime. One of our previous congregations had a full-size gym, and sometimes I would just take a random break and go there for 15 minutes and shoot baskets. I was diverting from the normal schedule. Second, withdraw weekly. Withdraw weekly. The suggestion is to take a day off, or most of a day off each week. I don't take an entire day off, almost never, but instead I prefer to take small parts of some days off. Third, abandon annually. Abandon annually means the recommendation is to take a vacation. I'm not good at vacations, so let's just say that's probably good advice and move on. I read an account of how 2 men started a journey across the great Arctic tundra. One man decided to stop and rest his dogs every 7th day. The other man, though, decided to drive his dogs straight through. It is said at the end of the first week, the first man, as he planned, stopped his team and rested his animals all that day. The other man, though, continued to travel. By the end of the second week, the man who had rested his dogs had almost caught up with the man who had traveled straight through. But again, the first man stopped to rest his dog team on day number 7. By the end of the third week, the man who had rested his team passed the man who had traveled straight through, and in the end, he reached the final destination far, far ahead of him, because rest matters. Now, don't misunderstand that example. I don't believe as Christians we are obligated to submit to some Old Testament sabbatical mandate. Seventh-day Adventists do. I don't believe that's necessary. In fact, Sabbath keeping is not repeated in the New Testament as a command for the church, but we should understand that the principle behind the Sabbath is still in effect. And that means we are to set aside some time in our schedules for rest, as long as that time is not on Sunday morning. There's no question, fatigue and exhaustion contributed to Elijah's depression. Now notice, cause 3 is stress. Stress. Stress can contribute to someone's depression. In confronting those false prophets, Elijah had been forced to endure an unusually stressful situation. Put ourselves in his place. He was put through a lot of emotional wear and tear. He had to survive tremendous emotional trauma because he had been positioned in a life and death struggle on Mount Carmel. Elijah's continued existence on this earth was totally contingent on his ability to receive an immediate answer from God and consume that actual animal sacrifice. Remember, there are only 3 possible answers to prayer: yes, no, and wait. If Elijah had prayed for God to send down fire and consume the sacrifice, and if he had gotten an answer of no or wait, then he would have died, because those 450 prophets from Baal would have torn him to shreds. Elijah had to have an immediate yes answer from God. He needed that answer right then and right there. God literally had to immediately consume that sacrifice, or else Elijah was going to be a dead prophet. People, that was an extremely stressful situation. More than 2 centuries ago, Thomas Paine, who was an atheist, remember, even a broken clock is correct twice a day, he made this quotation famous: "These are times that try men's souls." People, if it was bad then, it's even worse now. And according to biblical prophecies, it's not going to get better until it actually gets worse. Life is extremely stressful. I read about a man who had gone to see his physician. He complained of constant headaches. So after a series of questions, the doctor suggested he stop smoking and using alcohol. He did, and still the headaches persisted. His doctor then suggested he'd stop doing anything physical that would put pressure on his back. He did that, but his headaches persisted. The pain just pulsed through his head. In the final analysis, the doctors discovered that he was wearing a size 15 shirt collar on a size 17 neck. That's self-induced stress, and it's not necessary. One of the secrets in handling stress is to eliminate all stress that is unnecessary. If possible, minimize stress. And that might mean learning to say no. Saying no is difficult for me, but sometimes it has to happen. Life is hard enough. Life is hard enough to allow stress to take us on. Eliminate unneeded stress. Don't complicate matters in attempting to do too much. Some stress is unavoidable, but the secret to avoiding depression is learning to handle stress so that stress doesn't mishandle us. Elijah's had success, and it brought him problems. Elijah's fatigued, and it got him into trouble. Elijah's been stressed out. He's been on the edge, and now he's a mess. Cause 4 is disillusionment. Elijah was disillusioned. And disillusionment can contribute to someone's depression. This was the situation. Elijah had hoped this confrontation on Mount Carmel would have caused a national repentance in Israel. Remember in chapter 18 that the people in mass numbers had acknowledged the Lord as the one true God. After seeing God send down fire from heaven and consume this sacrifice, the people were convinced that Yahweh was the one true God. 1 Kings 18, verse 39. Now, when all the people saw it, meaning saw the miracle on Mount Carmel, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Elijah hoped this massive public confession would result in a national spiritual awakening, but it didn't. Elijah was so hopeful that after God defeated Baal, it would convince Ahab to go home and act like a man and actually stand up to Jezebel and challenge Jezebel to reject her paganism. The problem was none of what Elijah had hoped would happen actually happened. And so now he was disillusioned, just as some of us have been. For instance, someone is anticipating a promotion, and then he learns that position had been given to someone less qualified than he is. So he's disillusioned. Someone finds this perfect house at a fantastic price, and then because of some minuscule technicality, he can't qualify for the mortgage. So he's disillusioned. Because it seemed to be the best thing for his career, someone resigns his current position and accepts a job at another corporation. At the beginning, it was okay, but after 3 months, he can't stand his supervisor and is totally frustrated out of his mind. So he's bummed out from disillusionment. Some time ago, a divorce attorney submitted the opinion that most divorces result from romanticized expectations. Most divorces result from romanticized expectations, translated as Jack thinks being married to Jill will be absolute utter bliss. He consistently calls her angel and sweetie. But then not long after the honeymoon, reality sets in. There are hormonal moods, weight gains, late dinners, or no dinner at all. He silently asks himself how he ever got into this. He secretly thinks that she has deceived him, and now he feels trapped. On the other side, before marriage, Jill's heart would beat just a little faster when she thought about Jack. It would be heaven to be married to him, she thought. Then after marriage, she has to contend with his messes, his addiction to sports on television, his painful insensitivities, his complete lack of romance. The doorknob he promised to fix months earlier still comes off in her hand. Jill cries a lot and starts looking up marriage counselors online. Author John Powell, in his book entitled Happiness is an Inside Job, said disillusionment always seems to follow us. Don't miss this. Disillusionment always seems to follow us when we expect someone else to make us happy. Such expectations are a parade that always gets rained on. The place called Camelot and the person called right just do not exist. I once saw a cartoon of a woman standing over her diminutive seated husband, demanding, "Make me happy, make me happy." The point is, most marriages end because of disillusionment. I understand disillusionment. Promises made to me, promises not kept. Christian, if you have been disillusioned, and this disillusionment has contributed to depression, then let me share some excellent advice. Listen to this. The basic advice in principle form is, things are almost never as good as they sound, and things are almost never as bad as they seem. Things are almost never as good as they sound, and things are almost never as bad as they seem. The fact is, some things are just not as they seem to be. And the reason why people sometimes overreact to situations and end up depressed is that people don't realize that things are almost never as good as they sound, and things are almost never as bad as they seem. Let me mention an example of this. Listen carefully. This is one of my all-time favorite stories, okay? In Great Britain, in the latter stages of World War II, because of restrictions on airlines and other things, an American two-star general was seated in a little railroad compartment on a train with a lieutenant in the American Army. And across from the general and this lieutenant, facing them on another seat in that compartment, was an elderly English woman and her beautiful, and I mean beautiful, young niece. And as the train proceeded down the track, this American general and this American lieutenant began to cast appreciative glances at this young woman, glances that developed into full-fledged, almost lecherous stares. And then the train began to pass in and out through a series of tunnels. Now, because of wartime restrictions, lights inside the train had to be turned off at all times. And so it was extremely dark when the train would go through a tunnel. Once inside a tunnel, darkness would just saturate the compartment of the train. It just so happened the train went through an especially long tunnel, and out of the darkness came the resounding sound of a kiss, followed by the tremendous sound of a slap. When the train emerged into the daylight again, the American general was sitting there, gingerly feeling the side of his face where the red welt of a handprint was beginning to develop. His lieutenant was seated beside him, his arms folded like this, looking out the corner of his eye, like, what's going on here? This old aunt across from the general was looking at him with a slightly bemused expression on her face, and the young woman was just sitting there staring straight ahead. In their minds, collectively, these thoughts were running through them. The general was thinking, that smart aleck lieutenant, He leaned across and kissed that beautiful girl, and she retaliated and swung at him, missed, and hit me in the face. The old lady was looking at the general and thinking, that old goat, it serves him right. He tried to kiss my niece, and she slapped him. The niece was thinking, that general tried to kiss me and missed, and kissed my aunt instead, and she slapped him. And the lieutenant was thinking, this has got to be my day when you can kiss the back of your hand and then slug a 2-star general and get away with it. The point is, things are not always as they seem to be. So don't let disillusionment get you down. 4 factors that contribute to someone being depressed: success, fatigue, stress, and disillusionment. Someone said, we are solely responsible for creating our own depression. It wasn't given to us, therefore we can deconstruct it too. And next time, we will talk about exactly how to do that. It's noon, so let's stand to our feet. Everyone standing? So glad you've been here today. I hope you learned something. Come back. Today was all about the problem. Next week is all about how to fix the problem. So you don't want to miss next week, okay? Definitely don't want to do that. We usually close with a song, but we're running late, so we won't do that this morning. But I'm so glad you've come. First Sunday of 2025. I'm asking God to bless this year, unlike last year, even more so. We were blessed last year, but we're asking for more. Father in heaven, I thank you for your goodness to us as individuals and to this church collectively. We have much to be grateful for. There are people in this room who 12 months ago did not know you, were not in this church, did not have a relationship with you through your son Jesus, but today they do. They have Christ in them, and they have eternal life, and they have so much to look forward to, and I'm grateful for that. But Father, we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. We believe you've called on us to sell these properties, these buildings, and enable us to move somewhere else, hopefully where we can be more visible and accessible, and in a location that where there's more traffic and where our church can grow even more. We look forward to that, and we ask you for that. God, we are trusting you for that. We believe you for that. And when that happens, we will be forever grateful, and we will not cease to tell people this is what God did. So, Father, thank you for this morning. I hope it's been helpful. Bless us as we go throughout this week. Keep us safe, keep us healthy, and help us to come back next Sunday excited to meet with you again. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.